Hi, AD4 Creative Shrimp here, and you're watching the photogrammetry course with Blender and Reality Capture. In these videos, as a kind of bonus to this PBR section, we've decided to include some thoughts on how to actually use some of the surfaces that we're making from photogrammetry. We've included the end blend file in the project files, so you might actually just prefer to dig into that yourself. But otherwise, feel free to join us for a bowl of noodle soup. Here we'll take a look at mixing together different materials within Blender. We'll use a few different ground textures to get this done. When you have height maps, it opens up a few different ways that you can mix together those materials. For example, we can specify a height at which we want one of the other layers to take over, or we can easily mix in a flat layer that can kind of act as our water layer, or we can simply mix depending on which height map happens to have the highest or lowest values of that part of the texture, depending on how you want to set it up, that is. First though, let's get into setting up how we might mix between multiple layers simply at first and slowly build up a little bit of complexity as we go on. So here I am in a mostly standard Blender scene and I'm ready to start adding in some textures. For example, I've got 4 different sets of PBR textures in this folder, and I'm going to start with a set of dirt textures. For the base color input, we'll use the albedo texture, though the diffuse here would work just fine too. It just has a bit more natural occlusion shading left in. I'm going to try to stick to just albedo textures throughout here though. To get these textures into our scene, I'm going to left click and drag on the image icon itself and not the name into the shading editor. I want the albedo, the displacement and the normals dragging in. The base color can be pretty simple, just plug in the albedo texture there. The displacement texture needs a displacement node hooking up to the material output, and then we can plug our texture into the height socket. So far the color spaces are all fine. The albedo automatically came in as sRGB, which is fine. The EXR file is always linear, so that got set automatically too. But for the normal map, that is currently set as sRGB. But this texture is not designed to be looked at, of course. It's going to perform some trickery on the normals, creating some lighting shenanigans, basically. So we'll need to let Blender know not to apply any color curves or contrast or anything like that to it. And so we'll set that as non-color data. For this to work properly though, we'll need a normal map node, and then we can hook these up. Next, we need to know what coordinates we're going to use and hook that up. We just have the one UV set, so I'll simply take the UV output of the texture coordinates node and plug that in to our albedo. Then if we want to change the scaling of our textures or how much we want to tile these textures, we can use a vector math node and drop that in. Then we can set that to multiply. We'll need that for all of our textures here. I'll just neaten things up a little bit by right-clicking and dragging across the line to insert a reroute node, and then use Ctrl-H to collapse and clean up that node there so it hides the sockets that we're not using out of that node. And I'll set all the fields of the vector math node to 1, so that currently the UV scaling is unchanged. That is to say, something multiplied by 1 is just going to be itself. On the normal map node, we can specify the UV map we're using, though even with that blank, Blender will just assume we should be using that UV map anyway, as it's the only one we have on the mesh at the moment. Alright, so now we've set up the basic nodes required for a very simple PBR material. We can check how it's looking so far in the 3D view. At the moment, we're looking at one of these default HDRI lighting environments, which for us makes our shadowing look a little bit washed out and flat. From the pull down though, we can switch that to use the lights and world lighting of the scene instead though. That means that the material preview and the render settings are exactly the same, which currently is a little bit pointless. However, we'll be switching over to using cycles as our renderer so that we can get some good micro displacement for the height map, which is something that will only show up in the render view and not the material preview. So we'll come back to that in a moment. First though, I'll switch to GPU compute to get a little bit more speed up here and set the viewport and render samples to something fairly low, like 16. Now let's set up the micro displacement, as we don't have any showing in the render view just yet. So jumping over to the modifiers tab, I'll add a subdivision surface modifier. I set it to simple, so the original vertices of our mesh stay where they are. Then we'll switch to the experimental feature set. And now we have an extra checkbox on the modifier called adaptive subdivision that we can enable. Finally, for this to show, we just need to go over to the material settings and switch from bump to displacement only. And there we go, a perfect displacement. Well, not quite, it's a bit on the extreme side. And also, if we look from the side, we can see that it's using mostly negative values, so it's pushing it all down when compared to where the original geometry is. So we'll offset the mid-level there, setting this to 0. Looks about right there. Then let's deal with how extreme it is by setting the displacement scale down to 0.05. That looks about right now. Setting the dicing scale lower should give us some more resolution there, allowing for smaller polygons. I think that's all we need here in the viewport. One last thing is to right-click the plane and choose to shade smooth. That way we shouldn't see any little hard edges between the polygons. Remember earlier within Eevee where we had the material preview and the render looking exactly the same? Now that we're in cycles, we can use the lighting and world lighting of the scene within this view to get a faster representation of how everything will look within the render view. It's the Eevee render engine that powers Cycle's material preview view, so we can kind of get the benefit of switching between both engines pretty effortlessly here. The main current difference between the engines will just be the lack of displacement in Eevee, but it is useful for us to get real-time smooth updates when we adjust our lighting, for example. In this case, I'll move this light a little bit closer and lower to the plane to help the reflectivity of the surface be just a bit more apparent. I'll switch over from a point light to an area light, turn down the power quite a bit to just 50 for a moment, and then increase the size of both X and Y to 0.25. We could also adjust the size of the light within the 3D view by scaling, though this doesn't update the size field in the properties window unless we were to apply that scale with Control A, though I'm not going to do that here. I'll just be eyeballing it, so to speak, within the 3D view. I'll take up the power of the light just a little more to 75 and then adjust the strength of the world lighting by just raising the overall brightness up a little bit. That'll help to brighten even the shadowy areas, just a little to help reveal a little bit more detail in the albedo texture. So the reason we have this light here is to really help with showing the reflectivity of that light on the surface, our roughness of the surface in other words. At the moment, even though it's all one uniform value of roughness, our eye can be tricked into thinking there's more roughness variety than there really is. So just to make things really obvious what's going on here, we'll mute the normal map node with the M key. But as we'll see, within this material preview mode, the displacement node is also acting like a bump map, so we're going to mute that too. Now we can see how uniform the reflections across the surface really are. Just before we move on to the roughness map though, we'll just create a very common extra feature for our albedo texture, which should help it match everything else that might be in the scene, and that's by giving ourselves some tint control. It's pretty easy to set up. All we need is a color mix RGB node dropped in after the texture, and then we can either set this to multiply or divide. If we set this to multiply and increase the factor to 1, with the second color swatch set to white, we're currently in a neutral state, as we can see by muting and unmuting the node. We could just use this color swatch here, or we can create a new input RGB node. Left click and drag the white color onto it and then plug this in. This is an optional step. We don't have to add this extra node, but it might help keep things clear in the node graph where all your controls are. Once we have that plugged in with full brightness, we can change the hue to tint our surface with that color. Another option is to divide instead of multiply, and that will behave like a sort of color we're trying to eliminate from the surface. This might typically be a bluish tone, that extra subtle little bit of sky color that we may have gotten into our texture, so we can remove that like this. We can also lower the brightness value in the node to actually increase the brightness in the viewport too. If we were looking to darken the texture instead, then we'd probably need to be setting this to multiply. Once you have more textures and objects in your scene, you can choose whether to multiply or to divide to get the kind of cohesion you're looking for between the textures. With that done, let's move on to the roughness. At the moment we're recording this, it's very hard to get access to the kinds of technology that will be able to capture true roughness maps from photography. Any other ideas such as using polarized filters and so on still require a lot of adjustment and manipulation after capture. It's with this in mind that we've preferred to generate our roughness maps from the albedo texture with some masking or painting where necessary. And this is pretty easy and simple to do in this case. We just need a color ramp that we can plug our albedo into and then into the roughness socket of the principled shader. Now what's happening is the darker parts of the texture will be considered quite shiny, and the lighter the texture, the rougher the values. I think with this texture, the darker dirt would probably be less reflective, so we actually want to flip these around. Then we can bring the sliders closer together to get much higher contrast and transition between the smoothest and roughest parts of the surface. Control-Shift clicking on this color ramp node, we can see exactly what we're doing to the texture map itself. This dirt surface should be pretty rough overall, so we would expect the majority of it to be quite light, so a higher rough value, with the occasional bit of smoother stone or other polished aspects of the surface within the overall dirt texture. At the moment, because we're using black here, that means some of the surface is being treated as if it's a perfect mirror shine, which isn't very suitable here. The whole of the surface should be quite rough, so we'll lighten this up a bit to somewhere around 0.5. We can also drop the roughness down slightly, so it's not quite as rough as, for example, rubber. Somewhere around 0.8 looks like it works pretty well though. Now I can unmute the normal map node and we can see our albedo, roughness and normal maps working together. Let's unmute the displacement and check that out in Cycles rendered view. I think that's working pretty nicely. I'll just tidy the nodes up a little bit with some reroute nodes, and I think we can consider this a pretty good setup for a single layer PBR material. To work with multiple layers, we're going to need to be able to mix between multiple height maps. So that we only need to work with one displacement node, what we can do is ignore the mid-level and scale parameters and recreate them ourselves as math nodes. To start with, I'll duplicate the displacement node and then we'll be able to compare the results between them while we set up. I'll reconnect the displacement node by control-clicking the wire coming from the node and redirecting it to the output of our new displacement node. And for this to work easily, we'll need to set our displacement node to a sort of neutral position, which would be a 0 mid-level and a scale of 1. Next, we'll create a math node and use F2 to rename it to mid-level. With it set to add, this should emulate the mid-level nicely. Our mid-level is 0, so we can leave that as it is, as that's what our other displacement mid-level is set to. And then we can use Shift D to duplicate that math node and switch this to multiply and set that to 0.05. Again, which is the value of the scale we have in the original displacement node. Control left clicking the results of this between the two nodes, we should see they give basically identical results. So with that done, we can delete the other displacement node and then tidy things up a little bit here using F2 to rename the node to scale. So now at this point, we have a node that can control our tiling. We have a setup for tinting, the albedo, and we have some controls to create a roughness map. We've also got a couple of math nodes to act as mid-level and scale for our displacement. So all of these nodes here can be selected and we can use Shift P to parent them to a frame that we can then label with F2 as dirt. I'll also create another frame above this to stand as an additional title and call this Layer 1. Give it a little color and then increase the label size. With that done, we only need to control two wires going out of this frame, one for the shader and one for the height input of the displacement node. If we duplicate all of that with Shift D, we can place that beneath the other layer and use this as the basis for our new set of textures. Let's use the Asphalt 03 textures. So I'll find that folder and double click into it. Then I'll drag the little image icons into the shader editor. And now that means they're actually within our scene. So we'll be able to find them using the texture pull down menu next to the names in the image texture nodes themselves. We do need to be careful with the normal map node though, as that should be set to non-color. Currently it's switched back to sRGB because that's what the image node we've just dragged into the scene is set to by default. I'll come back and remember to do this in a moment. For now, let's Control-Shift click on this shader to see it in the viewport, and also find this in the image editor. The most obvious detail about these textures are that they're not a square ratio. They're instead a 2:1 ratio. So here's where we'll need to adjust our tiling settings. Setting the X value to 2 looks like it's the right axis to be adjusting here. If we don't want any tint at all, by the way, all we need to do is to simply mute the mix node. Taking a look at the roughness map by Control-Shift clicking on it, it looks like it could probably do with being a little bit higher contrast, as it almost looks all like one value at the moment. So I'll click on the darker value and then click on the color swatch below to lower that down. We can also make it even higher contrast by squeezing these values closer together. Let's take a look at the result of that by Control-Shift clicking on the principled shader itself. The overall result is a little bit dark. This is what typically might happen if the normal map isn't set up correctly, which it isn't here, which is what reminds me to actually change the color space from sRGB to non-color. And now it's looking a lot better. Next, let's correct the displacement by plugging our layer 2 texture map into the height socket of the displacement node. To see this properly, we need to switch over to the rendered view and then take a look from the side to adjust the math nodes that we added to get the correct mid-level and scale for our displacement. At a scale of 1, this will really make it much clearer where the mid-level really should be. It looks like it should be 0.5 to me, and the scale should be about 0.1. That's looking much better to me now. The next task is to find a way to mix these two layers together. First, I'll clean things up a little bit by adding reroute nodes that extend just outside of that layer's frames. Then to mix the shaders together, we'll need a mix shader node and then plug the shaders in. Then for the displacement, we'll just use a color mix RGB node and plug the heights in there. Next, we'll use an input value to drive both the mix of the shader and the mix of the height. At a value of 0.5, we're getting an equal mix of both layers, or rather both layers are turned down to a half strength. The closer we are to 0, we'll be favoring more of the first layer, our dirt surface, and the closer to 1 will favor the second layer, our asphalt surface. We only really want this value to go between 0 and 1, and it's easy to slide outside of those values with the default value node. So here's a quick tip. If you know you're going to just want to be sliding between a set range, for this we'll need a color mix RGB node, so I'll just use Shift-D to duplicate the other one and then drop that in after the value node. For simplicity of this example, we don't actually need a value node, so I'll delete that. Instead, we'll use the color swatches to represent our numerical values. So black will be 0 and white will be 1. And now we have that easy click and slide slider to use to blend between the materials without worrying about going too far outside of the desired range. So far, the only blending that we can do is kind of global. We currently don't have much control over where on this plane we might want the layers to blend. We could use another image that we can paint on as a sort of mask, or we could do some procedural texturing, or we could do something that should be pretty light when compared to other options, which is to paint our vertices to tell Blender where to place each material. For this to work though, we need a few more vertices. So I'll tap into edit mode and right click to subdivide. Opening up the tool there, we can increase our subdivisions to 10 before it lets us go no further. So I think we need just a little bit more. So I'll click in the field and take this up to 16. With that done, I'll switch over to Vertex Paint, which will automatically create a vertex set for us. We can see that now by adding in the shader editor and import vertex color node, selecting the color set from the pull down and Control Shift clicking it to see just what this currently looks like cleanly in the viewport. By default, it should be pure white. It looks a little off-white at the moment, simply because of the fancy scaling of values that our Filmic color management is doing, but we can ignore that for our purposes here. This will still be a value of 1. That will tell Blender wherever a vertex has this value, it'll show only the second layer from our mix nodes. While we can see a lot of the tools in the top of the 3D view, we can actually see a little more if we go into the Properties window and click on the Tools tab at the top. For example, we can see we have white and black by default as the two colors we can currently swap between. The shortcut for this while painting in the 3D view is X. Now with our current strength of 1, we can paint pure black onto any of the vertices under our stroke, which will eventually reveal our first layer. Then we can press X to switch back and paint back the second layer with our value of 1, or white in other words. We can also flood fill a value by going to the paint menu and choosing set vertex colors. So with that done, let's actually hook this up so that rather than seeing the vertex colors themselves, we'll see the result of them mixing our layers. We don't really need our color mix node to blend globally between 0 and 1 anymore, but I'll keep that around for the moment and just plug the vertex color node into where that 1 was going instead. For a very basic vertex blend, this is all we need to do. Now we can see that when we paint black onto the plane, we're revealing our dirt layer, and where we paint white, we're laying down our asphalt layer. Taking a look in rendered mode, just to check out displacement, shows that everything seems to be working well there too. Our main problem here really is that with only the few hundred vertices that we have to paint on, we're really only getting quite a soft large gradient between the layers. It would probably look a lot cooler being able to tighten that up to get sharper transitions between the layers. One way to do that is with a math node, set to power. The higher we set this, the sharper the transition we get. To see exactly what's happening, I'll Control-Shift-Click on the math node and then play with the value to show those gradients changing, depending on whether we increase or decrease this value. Control-Shift-Clicking back on the mix shader to see the results, we can see that currently this is looking pretty good as we paint on our vertices. However, over in the rendered view, while the albedo, roughness and normal are working well, the displacement looks a bit angular and harsh where it blends. To help with this, we can kind of split what we're doing with the displacement away from the other images by simply having the math node just affect the mix shader, while the raw vertex colors with the softer gradient blends between the height maps. With our current setup, we're just mixing between the height maps. As one layer takes over, the other layer reduces in intensity. That's one way we might like it to work. But what if we wanted our height maps to be accumulative? So rather than simply having one or the other, we could actually have a maximum of both at the same time. To do this, we'd need to be able to add them together. We can do this by just switching the mix RGB node to add. Now we just need to consider exactly what we want to happen. To demonstrate this, instead of using the vertex colors just for a moment, I'll just plug back in our mix RGB node that's acting as a simple global layer slider from 0 to 1. At a value of 0, we could have just the first layer. At a value of 1, we could just have the second layer. But at a value of 0.5, instead of having both layers at half strength, we could have both layers at maximum strength. So to achieve this, we can use a map range node. This is going to act a bit like a color ramp. To illustrate this, I'll hook our vertex colors back up for a second by hooking them up to both the color ramp and the map range nodes. Moving the left slider back and forth to control the black end of the value spectrum is exactly the same as adjusting the from min value of the map range node. To make this more obvious, I'll set the map range from min value to 0.2 and the from max value to 0.8, and then set our color ramp to start at 0.2 and end at 0.8 as well. Toggling between them by Control-Shift clicking on them, you'll be able to see that this has exactly the same effect on our vertex colors. I find the color ramp a little easier to understand what's actually happening, but it's generally better practice to use the map range node as we have more options and inputs with it. So let's delete the color ramp and set this up with the map range node. Hopefully this will now make a bit more sense. What we're trying to set up is have a value of 0.5 mean that both height maps are set to 1, so they're both equally and fully strong. Thinking about the first layer for a moment, what we want are the values 0 to 0.5 to actually mean that the first layer's height map is 1 all the way through that range. So no change, just fully showing layer 1's height map throughout. But at 0.5 to 1, we want to be reducing our first layer's height map. So in other words, when our vertex colors are 0.5 or mid-gray, we get fully layer 1's height map, but as the value increases to white, or in other words to 1, we want less and less of layer 1's height map. So we can achieve this by setting the input range of 0.5 to 1 to output the range 1 to 0. Now that still might sound a little bit confusing, but let's test this out. So we should get fully white all the way to 0.5, and then it should look like it gradually decreases to black, or 0 in other words, which is what we've got. So let's take this a step further. First though, I'll just give us a little bit more space to work with here. So all we need to do is multiply our map range node with the height map. Now viewing the result of that multiply node in the 3D view, we can test out the value range again. And we should see no change in the strength of the height map between 0 and 0.5, but we should see it sort of fade away into black as we go from 0.5 to 1, which is what we're getting. So we can use the result of this and put it into our add node, which is combining the two layers together. So that's the first layer done. Of course, instead of just having a single value going into the map range, we'll be using our vertex colors, so I'll hook those back up. And we also want our vertex colors to inform the factor of the mix node between those layers, so we'll plug that back in too. So now we have the vertex colors telling Blender which layer we want to see. But also we have the vertex colors controlling the strength of our height map itself, so that we've kind of remapped when this first layer's height map will be at its strongest. Next, we need to set up the second layer. So let's unplug the current unchanged second layer height map from where it'll be ultimately added together with the first layer. Then we can duplicate the map range and multiply nodes and bring them down, and also plug in our vertex colors. And then I'll go Control Space to maximize the viewport here so that we can hook up the second layer height map into our multiply node. And like the first layer, that'll also get added together into the color mix RGB node that we've got there. The difference here though is that we need to alter the map range node. So let's Control Shift click on that so that we can see it in the viewport. To make it really easy, I'll just go back to a single value by unplugging the vertex colors temporarily here. So let's just think about what we want to achieve with the second layer. we want it to be outputting black at 0, and then by 0.5 be outputting white, and stay white all the way to an input of 1. So since we'll be going from black to white, we'll need our output to be from 0 to 1 and not flipped like we did with the first layer. Now let's see what we've got. Currently we've got values 0 to 0.5 all coming out as black, and then 0.5 to 1 being a gradient from black to white. That's not quite what we want, but we can alter this to go from 0 to 0.5, and then that should be all we need. So in other words, when we input a value of 0, we'll get an output of 0. And when we input a value of 0.5, we'll get an output of 1 with a linear interpolation between those values. Clicking through the values there looks like we've got everything working as we want, with 0.5 to 1 all being the same white output, so we should get no changing strength on our second layer as the first layer fades out. And then we're pretty much done with remapping all of our values so that they can add together, and at mid-gray, or 0.5 in other words, we'll have both height maps fully on, but just added together. All we'd need to do is to plug our vertex colors back in and Control-Shift-Click on the Add node to see the results. Before we move on though, I'll plug in the mix node that we have there hanging around just to make it easy to double check what we've set up by sliding in between 0 and 1. I'll slide it down to 0, so we should just be seeing the results of the first height map, which Control-Shift-Clicking between the height map and after we've applied our map range to it looks to be identical, which is what we wanted. Sliding it up to 1, and then actually we'll take a look from after the Add node. And we should still see that this is identical to just the raw height map from before the map range shenanigans. And just for completeness, of course, that is true when we slide back to 0 and show the first layer again, when compared to after the Add node as well. Sliding between 0 and 1 should show the second layer being added in until we reach 0.5, where both layers are fully added together, and then at which point between 0.5 and 1, the first layer begins to fade out until we're just left with the second height map, still at max strength. So hopefully that makes sense. It's probably one of the more confusing aspects of this, but otherwise it's overall pretty simple and straightforward. With that done, we can plug our vertex colors back in again and Control-Shift-Click the Mix Shader node to see the current results. And with white, I can paint back in here at full strength the second layer, asphalt layer in this case. And painting in black, I can remove that layer. At a strength of 0.5, it will take a few strokes over the same area until we accumulate a full black. And so we can get a nicer area of mid-gray, which will have a little bit of both layers visible, depending on how strong we have our power node set, that is, as that's increasing our contrast. Moving over to rendered view, keep in mind that the map range alterations we've just been doing is only for the height maps. The shaders themselves are being mixed only with a simple vertex coloring and power node for the moment. We could make the shaders mix together a little more interestingly though, which is something we're going to set up next. First, I'll just rearrange a few things and give us a little more space to work and hopefully help it make a bit more sense. These nodes here are all to do with the displacement adding, so let's go Shift-P to frame those together. Currently, the power node is getting its wire from within that frame, so that's probably a little bit confusing. So I'll reroute that so it feels a bit more independent and away from that height stuff. Next, I'll rearrange this displacement stuff so that it's a bit more obvious what's going on. Let's put the Add node in the middle and raise these nodes dealing with the first layer up a bit, and these ones dealing with the second layer down a bit. So that one of the shaders wire isn't going right through the middle of all of this, I'll reroute that around the frame, and then with this frame selected, I'll go F2 and name this Disp Values. Then I'll add another frame and resize it at the top here, where I'll add a little bit more information. Alright, so let's make the shader mix a little more interesting than just using the vertex colors and power node. What we can do is multiply our vertex colors together with something else, such as an image texture or some procedural noise, which is what I'll set up here now. So first we need a math node set to multiply, and then we need a noise texture that we can put in the second socket. I'll set the noise scale to something like 10 with a bit more detail in the noise, something around 5 I find tends to work quite well. To make this a bit more prominent, I'll add in a color ramp and squeeze together the black and white of the ramp here to increase the contrast quite a bit. So now instead of the simple vertex colors, we've got this noise multiplied in with it. The current limitation of this setup though is that we can see that if we wanted just the pure white here, that is to say just the second layer in a specific area, and currently that might not be possible if that's where our procedural noise happens to be dark. So really we want our noise to just be affecting the edges of what we've already painted in with the vertex colors, rather than creating new areas that are kind of random. So to be able to introduce white back into it, we'll need to add back our vertex colors, and also a few reroute nodes as it happens, because we need to clean up the layout there. But now we can see that adding them back means we can get pure white back, or at least almost. It still looks kind of patchy. I think that's just the effect of the color management filmic scaling values above 1. We can simply get around this though by clamping both of these math nodes so that we don't get any values outside of 0 and 1. And with that, it looks like we've got a much more interesting border to each of our paint strokes. Again, without that add node, we can see we're going to get dark splodges that we don't really intend to get. So adding our bright vertex colors back in means we can get pure black and pure white anywhere we choose now. Or in other words, completely layer 1 or completely layer 2, wherever we like. With that done, I'll just neaten up the nodes a little here, and then parent our new nodes to a new frame with Shift P, and then F2 to rename this to Blend Noise and Vertex Colors. Let's take a look at the final effect by Control-Shift clicking on the end Mix Shader node to see that in the 3D view. Toggling the noise node with the M key shows the before and after effect that the noise is given to the borders of our strokes. It doesn't have to be procedural noise going in here, it could be one of the textures. For example, using one of the albedo textures should work quite well. Here I'll plug in the texture from layer 1. It's a little confusing with the wire cutting back and across everything there though, so I'll just reroute that around to make it a little bit more readable. With that plugged into the color ramp though, we can then check out what the mask looks like by Control-Shift clicking on it and adjusting the contrast so that we get a good separation between dark and light there. And then Control-Shift clicking on the Mix Shader again will show us our results. Sometimes different textures work better than others, so feel free to experiment with that. In this example, I'm leaning towards just using procedural noise, so I'll undo a few of those steps there to just return to that setup. Alright, so that should conclude our setup blending together 2 layers, though we will return back to this setup at the end for a tip on how to extend this material should we want to keep on adding layers. But for where we are here, this should wrap up the main setup and idea behind layering the 2 sets of textures with vertex colors.